Alicia Keys does have a connection to one of the two museums that have recently been in the news for protests related to Palestine. I've seen folks talk about these two things separately, but I want to talk about them together. Over the past 7 days, there have been two protests at relatively known museums in New York, MoMA and the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum recently wrapped up Spike Lee's exhibit on his World War II propaganda poster, and Alicia Keys and Swizz Beatz dropped their art collection exhibition called Giant. This is their privately owned collection that they are showing and opening up for folks to see. And during the exhibition, protesters were escorted out of the museum. And at the MoMA over this past weekend, the same thing happened. Protesters are highlighting both museums' financial relationships and ties to Israel. Museums are the sites of collective organizing, and we need to keep our eyes on. Herein lies a good example and the problematic aspect of white feminism. You know, much of the outcry around things like white women curators over African art, white women that are, you know, predominantly in leadership roles in social work departments, or white women that are executive directors over nonprofits, you know, is much of the outcry again is from like Black, POC, African, you know, folks. It's not from white women themselves. That's one of the main reasons why I wanted to know like what the board of the New Orleans Museum of Art looks like, because if the white women are not saying to other white women, listen, you don't need to be over African art, you know, it's not, it almost doesn't matter, right? Like, and we see how they continue to move forward in these kind of roles because they are not living by these DEI optics versus impact. So a few points on the white woman curator that is over the African art kind of collection at the New Orleans Museum of Art. The first thing is it reminded me of the white woman that wrote the book on trap feminism. Do y'all remember that from last year? The second thing that kind of came up when I was reading the article about this curator is that it mentions that she has an expertise in kind of studying how institutions collect and display art. And I thought that that was a really interesting expertise, because if she's able to understand and process, you know, the problematic white supremacist kind of foundation of that, why doesn't she understand how who the curator is of those types of exhibits are also a part of the problematic nature of white supremacy? Okay, and then the third point that kind of came up while I was reading the article, but then also the person that I first saw post about this on TikTok, the article, she asked the question, how can this curator relate to African art? And I thought that that was such a intentional question related to why this is so problematic. It reminds me of some of the points that I brought up in my video on art, whiteness, and the female gaze. And I talked about the difference between the male gaze, the female gaze, and then I offer, you know, my perspective on how a Black queer feminist gaze on art would be more holistic. So when we think about the female gaze and what that perspective applies to art, this is a really interesting situation. I'm running out of light fast, y'all, so we're gonna get through these points. As I was going through the comments on that TikTok where I initially saw this article, one of the kind of recurring supports for why this isn't problematic is that this person has the credentials. You know, she has a PhD and she's, you know, been a curator in all of these different spaces, you know, Yale University, the North Carolina Museum of Art, and so on and so forth. And it made me think about, you know, credentialing as a tool for white supremacy, specifically like credentials and the racism of intelligence, and that it can be rationalized, you know, that she has the credentials to be able to, you know, clearly curate a show, but this cultural piece related to African art and that question about how does she relate to African art is important. Okay, I brought y'all a little closer because, like I said, I'm running out of natural light and I want to try to get through a few more of these. So the other thing that this particular article brought up for me is, of course, white women in nonprofit and art institutions and how they center themselves, you know. I find it so interesting that someone's credentials in this particular situation related to, I would say, a specialty collection, you know, African art in New Orleans, and then you're hiring a white curator. This is just another kind of layer to this expertise that she says that she has about institutions and how they collect and display art, and the absence of understanding her position as a white woman, again, in a nonprofit and an art institution. Okay, we had to make some adjustments. I had to switch up, turn the light on, move to a different room because I want to get through. I want to talk about this. So the other point that I had about this was, you know, museums need to continue to do their decolonization work. You know, they will kind of do, they meaning these institutions will do these different like DEI efforts, you know, for optics versus impact. And this is an example of how, you know, DEI efforts in these kind of spaces are more related to the optics. And it's not really rooted in any type of embodied practices, because the rationale for hiring a white woman for the African art collection, it cannot align with any kind of DEI strategies and goals. Okay, so the last two things that I'll say about this is I haven't taken the time to look up what the New Orleans Museum of Art, what their board looks like, but I want, like, that's the first, well, not the first question, so many questions, but one of the questions that I have, you know, is what does the board look like? And these are the types of questions that I ask as a consultant working with, you know, arts organizations, museums, you know, around topics like this. So that's definitely important. And then the last thing that I'll say here, because I have a whole list of other things to talk about, and I'm probably going to post, you know, a much longer video on YouTube, is this is really interesting because it gives a proximity to other cultures that is uncomfortable and disingenuous.